Opening credits. Going Underground. Vampire Paranormal Romance Short Story. By Selena Coffey. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Chapter 1. So you're telling me, Leliana said as she leaned back in her chair, that your daughter has gone missing. She folded her hands in front of her and kicked up her feet on the edge of her desk as she stared down her most recent prospective client. He was a wealthy man, if naive, and it didn't take much for her to see that he had been out of his depth long before he had made it to her doorstep. The man, one Mr. James Cooper, was seated opposite her, in one of the wooden chairs set up for clients to take a seat at while they told her of their woes. He fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable with her light scrutiny of his disposition, before clearing his throat and sitting up a little straighter in his seat. Yes, that's right," he said with a cough of embarrassment. "Succinctly put, Miss Tornbow." He fidgeted in his seat again. "I fear that she has been kidnapped, but the police won't do anything about it. They assume that because she's been a troublemaker in the past, that she's just run off. I feel like I have nowhere else to turn to." Leliana wondered if it burned him that he had to walk through Harlem to get to her, or even that it was her that he had to turn to. She smoothed out the sleeves of her peacoat, the heather-gray fabric stark against her deep umber skin. Normally, it wasn't an issue for anyone who came here. Almost all of the people that found their way here were the kindest people that she could have hoped to work with, no matter where they came from. But this man was clearly not used to venturing far out of his gilded community, and the streets of Harlem might have been quite the shock to his sensitivities. Still, a contract was a contract, she thought to herself as she observed him. "And you want me to go and find her, and preferably bring her home?" He nodded mutely. She sighed and rubbed at the bridge of her nose. "Do you have any evidence indicating that that isn't the case? That she hasn't run off, I mean," she said before realizing how that sounded. "Not that I want to come across as insensitive. Whatever the case may be, I'll find your daughter," she vowed as she straightened in her chair, pulling her feet down and tucking them back under the desk. "Oh?" He evidently hadn't anticipated that line of questioning. Perhaps he hadn't thought that she would consider his offer this seriously, or perhaps he was just used to being turned away by the police. Either way, he seemed to recover fairly quickly. Yes, just a moment." He fumbled in his briefcase beside his chair for a moment, before producing a photograph and a piece of paper. "Here," he handed the items over to her for her inspection. "I found them to be quite curious, as I'd never seen anything like it in my life." She gave the paper a once-over first, curious as to what it could contain. It was a letter, a farewell letter it seemed, written in deep red ink, and told her father that she was running away to get away from his tyranny. It wouldn't have struck her as odd, but for the ink color and the handwriting. She could have sworn that she'd seen it somewhere before, but she couldn't put her finger on where. "I'm guessing this isn't her handwriting," she said as she inspected the paper closer. She could faintly smell the scent of copper off of the paper, confirming her suspicions that the ink was, in fact, blood. So, she thought grimly as she set the paper aside. At least one vampire was involved. That complicated matters. Vampires, amongst other things that went bump in the night, weren't uncommon, and were usually not a problem. They all contributed to society, and there were ways for vampires in particular to find ways to feed without needing to harvest people. All in all, it was usually a non-issue when you ran into one. But there were outliers, ones that didn't like to obey the rules, and those were the ones that were hard as hell to deal with. Nobody liked them, not even their own kin, and it never took long for them to be caught with whatever it was that they were doing. She would have to cast her net of contacts wider, she realized. "It isn't in her hand, no," James said, hands resting on his dome of a midsection. "That's what had me worried." Leliana nodded, setting the letter to the side and picking up the photograph, turning it over to see what the camera had captured. She immediately set the photo down, to hide the fact that her hands were trembling. Depicted in the photo was a bedroom, decorated the way a young teenager might want, with books and a school bag and clothes strewn about. On the window, etched into the glass, was a symbol that would stick out in any ordinary setting, a circle with the letter X carved in the middle of it, with a line slicing the symbol in half vertically. Even to supernatural creatures, that symbol wasn't to be taken lightly. It was a notorious gang of vampires that often took their prey from wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and damn the consequences. They took people of all kinds, werewolf, human, vampire, even some ghouls if they were feeling particularly emboldened. The excavators, as they came to call themselves, always left this calling card behind whenever they took someone. The police rarely believed that they were involved. As they usually left no other evidence at the scene, it came to be assumed that it was an urban legend that people bought into. How do you tell someone that their daughter might be a thrall to a vampire? I've got some contacts to get in touch with, Leliana said as she tucked the photo away. But rest assured, I'll do everything I can to bring your daughter home safely. Oh, thank you. Thank you. The portly man said tearfully, as though he had finally found his salvation in her. She grimaced, and hoped that he didn't think of her that way. The case had only just started, and she was sure as shit no miracle worker, she thought with a frown. I'll reward you handsomely for your efforts. As they worked out the payment arrangements, she began to tick off in her head who she could reach out to in order to get info from the underground, the haven for most supernaturals that didn't want to fully conform to modern-day society, and those that wanted to get away for a while and appreciate the old society that most of them hailed from. It was quite a nice place, if she were being honest, she thought, as she bade farewell to Mr. Cooper. It was beneath the subway tunnels, accessed by vault doors left behind by those that built the tunnels in the first place. The underground was a cavernous, well-lit area, with its own natural resources and Victorian-style buildings. She often frequented the area after a case, as humans were welcome as well, so long as they minded themselves and accepted that if they started trouble they were on their own, and would likely never be heard from again. They had the best little tavern to drink away her sorrows, she recalled wistfully, practically tasting the last glass of old-fashioned whiskey she had down in those depths the last time that she was there. With a sigh, she tugged her peacoat tighter around her and stepped out of her office, heading down the alley beside her building to try and reach out to some of her contacts. Well, one in particular she knew she could get a hold of. Provided, of course, he was dealing right now. Sure enough, as she rounded the corner, she saw one of her more reliable contacts, Harvey, doling out blood pills to a vampire. Typically saved for prescription for vampires that needed blood, but couldn't get it, the medicine was an ideal quick fix for an urge to feed, as opposed to purchasing packaged blood that needed drinking. Damn, the worst possible time for her to run into Harvey, of course. She didn't think either of them saw her yet, so she ducked behind the dumpster and held her breath against the stench. She craned her neck toward them, straining to hear what was being said. I think I just saw some movement over there, she heard a smooth, unfamiliar voice say hesitantly, interrupting whatever conversation they had been having before. I'm sure it's nothing. Cops ain't the type to be sneaky, you know. There was Harvey's voice, as nasally as ever. Yeah, she tried to stifle a gasp as she realized that the new voice was coming closer to her. Shit, she thought as she frantically tried to find a better hiding spot that wouldn't blow her cover. Sadly, an alleyway doesn't really afford many places to crawl off and hide when one is in a pinch. Just let me check and see. For my own personal peace of mind. She sucked in a breath and rose to her feet, knowing that she had nowhere else to run, and it was better not to startle the vampire too much. You never know what could happen in a dark alleyway. I didn't mean to disturb you, Leliana said easily as she stepped into the open. The vampire had been far enough away that she didn't outright spook him, but he clearly still looked ill at ease, as though he was suspicious of her arrival. She couldn't say that she blamed him, per se. I came by to see if Harvey was available, that's all. She took in the vampire's appearance, and found that it was hard to look away. He stood tall, about a head taller than she was, and was incredibly lean in build. With black hair streaked with silver and eyes as cold as ice, she had to admit, the vampire was a sight to take in, but she still kept her guard up. This was still a stranger that she was dealing with in a dark alley with no real witnesses, no less. You don't say, the vampire said. He took a step closer to her and sniffed the air. You're no vampire, he said, aqua eyes narrowing at her. What business could you have with him? He deals in more than blood pills, sir, she said easily with a casual shrug. If she didn't make herself appear as a threat, then things would go over smoother. I just want information. Is that so? He said as he took another step closer. She held her ground, showing that she wasn't afraid of this vampire, who felt like he needed to assert dominance over her. It wasn't going to work on her, she thought firmly. Finish your business with him so I can conduct mine, she said in a no-nonsense tone. She was on the clock, and had no time to stand around comparing.
Censored.
With this man, a girl's life was at stake. And who's to say you wouldn't arrest me? Because I'm not the fuzz, she said, refraining from rolling her eyes. Really, she should be used to this sort of thing by now. Though she was a thicker woman, she otherwise looked the part of an off-duty officer, that was for sure. I'm a private investigator, hired to find someone who's gone missing. Nothing more. Fascinating, he said, his lips pulling up slowly into a smirk, one fang peeking out from the parting in his lips. She ignored how sexy that looked to her, and waited with bated breath for his response. Very well, I'll leave you be, dearie. He smirked, baring his fangs with the toothy grin. For now, at the very least. But I have a feeling that you and I will meet again, my dear. He licked his lips. And I'm looking forward to it. Just wait out on the sidewalk for me, all right, doll? She heard Harvey say from somewhere behind the vampire, but she still didn't take her eyes off of the strange man to check where. Sure thing, Harvey, she said with a nod. I can respect your privacy. She spun on her heel and walked back out by the door to her office to wait. Sure, what they were doing was technically illegal, but it was for a good cause, and really it wasn't worth losing one of her best contacts. After a few moments, she saw the telltale signs of a vampire taking his leave, a shadowed bat fluttering out of the alleyway and into the night. As she tugged her peacoat tighter around her, she walked back into the alleyway where, sure enough, Harvey was waiting for her, hands stuffed into his pinstriped pockets and a sleazy smile on his lips. Chapter 2. Hey Lely, he greeted her quietly. You sure are getting good at all that sneaking you've been doing, he laughed. That's the closest I've seen a human sneak up to a vampire without them noticing. You been practicing? Something like that, she said, struggling not to roll her eyes. That was evidently going to be the trial of the evening, not being a sarcastic cow to everyone who states the obvious or says something incredibly stupid to her. Anyway, I think we both know why I'm here, Harvey. Information, he said like it wasn't the most obvious thing in the world. She tried not to growl in frustration, but judging by the way that he flinched and backed away, she didn't quite succeed. Her patience was wearing thin, and he was clearly doing his best to be difficult with her. Fine, she thought as she cracked her neck. She could work with that. I'm not in the mood for games here, Harvey, she said through clenched teeth. A girl's life is at stake, and you'd do well to help me out before I start counting the hours that she's been missing by how many of your teeth I can knock out with my fists. To emphasize the point, she clenched a fist and brandished it at him, sealing the deal and causing him to actually cower against her threats. Harvey might like to talk big game, but threaten him with the slightest bit of violence, and suddenly he's a whimpering fool, willing to say anything if it means bodily harm won't come to him. All right, I'll talk, just don't hurt me, he said as he flailed his arms. She sighed heavily and lowered her arm, but still kept a fist formed just in case she needed to remind him of who was in charge of this conversation again. He tended to be so forgetful of those sorts of things after all. Talk, she demanded. What do you know about it, beyond the fact that the excavators are involved in her kidnapping? Shit, Harvey said, eyes wide as saucers. You know that the excavators are involved? He lowered his voice as his gaze darted around them, as though one of the vampiric gangsters would appear out of thin air and whisk them away too. Maybe they could, Leliana thought with a barely suppressed shudder. Maybe don't say that so loud, yeah? Who knows what's creeping around listening, yeah? His fidgeting grew worse, and she could visibly see his paranoia grow steadily worse as his fears took hold. She pinched the bridge of her nose and took a deep breath to keep from shaking some sense into him. Yes, she ground out. I know that they're involved in the kidnapping. And don't try to call it anything else because we both know that's what it is, a kidnapping. She glared particularly hard at him, to drive home the point that she wasn't here to be pulled around, and that she certainly wasn't leaving without answers. Now spill it. I'm nearly out of patience, Harvey. Right, he said hurriedly. Listen, there's more than just the excavators involved, and they're being protected by a group of vampires and humans called the Syndicate. I'm sure you've heard of them. She nodded, and knew instantly who he was referring to. Although the excavators were practically a myth in the human world, the Syndicate was well known as an old-school mafia that had a family consisting of vampires and humans that liked to hire other groups to do their dirty work. No wonder they had the excavators working for them, she thought. If the police didn't believe in them to begin with, their trail would go cold anyway. The Syndicate, she said to herself with a scoff. I can't say I'm terribly surprised. What else do you know? She asked, watching as Harvey tried to get his breathing in check. I don't know much more, Harvey said shakily. Just that there's supposed to be a meeting in the underground tomorrow night, at the Red Baron Inn, in the ballroom. Something's supposed to go down, but I don't know what. Leliana nodded. I feel like asking much more would just endanger us both, so I won't, she reassured him. She may not consider him a friend per se, but that didn't mean she wished him dead, by any stretch of the imagination. It's a lead, and that's more than I could have hoped for. Thank you, Harvey. Now go home for the night. You don't gotta tell me twice, sister. Harvey said as he scurried off into the shadows opposite from the way she came. Stuffing her hands into the pockets of her peacoat, she turned and made her way home, checking the skies for any bats following her. Later that evening, as she unlocked the door to her apartment and slipped inside, Leliana sighed and hung her coat on the coat hanger beside the door. She was tired, and all but threw herself down on her plush couch with a heavy sigh. The night had been long even before Mr. Cooper had come into her office with his job, to say nothing of her standoff with a vampire that she had never met before. It was hard not to practically sob when her phone started to ring. She had just gotten comfortable after all. But a private eye's work is never done, she knew, and so she rose and walked over to where the phone was resting on its little table and answered on the third ring. Hello, Tornbow PI, how can I help you? She answered, and hoped that she didn't sound too tired in doing so. A formal way to answer the phone, but it was necessary for her job. Clients would call all around the clock, and so it was imperative that she ensure professionalism at all times. What friends she had understood that, but still never ceased to tease her about it. It was what she was expecting to greet her ears at this hour, if she was being completely honest. Leliana, she froze at the deep voice on the other end of the line. It was the vampire from the alley, she was sure of it. But how did he get her number? And how did he learn her name? You have me at a disadvantage, she said, trying to keep her calm. Her mind whirred with the possibilities, and most of them related to her newest case. You know my name, but we weren't properly introduced in that alleyway. She wasn't one to crack under pressure, and worked best on her feet. Picking up her rotary dial phone, she paced its cord's length in her living room. If someone were watching, a moving target was harder to hit. You're a smart one, Miss Tornbow, he said smoothly. However, I would much rather make your acquaintanceship in a more formal setting. I don't do dinner dates with strangers. Flirtation was her default defense mechanism, and usually the one that got her out of tight spaces. A chuckle rumbled through the speaker of the phone. Oh, but I insist. After all, how else are you going to get into the ballroom at the Red Baron Inn tomorrow in the underground? It is invitation only. She felt a chill go up her spine. How did he know about that? Was he part of the syndicate? Or the excavators? She had to know. I'm guessing you have a way in. But of course, came the easy reply. Now my only question is, she said as she came to a standstill in her living room. Are you with the syndicate, or the excavators? Now that is an interesting question, he said with a husky laugh. I would be happy to disclose that information to you, when we meet. I eagerly await our formal introduction. She grimaced, wondering just what this vampire had up his sleeve and what he had to gain from bringing her into the lion's den. Was it a trap, or was he an independent party with his own agenda? She could only guess at what his motivations for getting involved could possibly be. "Where are we meeting?" she asked finally, deciding that it was better to go accompanied than to try and infiltrate the meeting alone. Maybe this was her ticket through the front door. It was hard to say. "Meet me at Gia's at 4:30. It's a lovely little coffee shop on 10th Street. Wear a dress, it's a formal meeting after all." With that, the call ended. Leliana sighed and set the phone back down on its little table before hanging up the handle on its receiver. With a sigh, she went into the bathroom and flicked the light on. Turning on the sink, she cupped her hands under the running faucet and splashed her face with some cold water, as though it would wake her from this bizarre dream that she was having. She was vaguely disappointed that it didn't, but had known better than to hope that it would anyway. Knowing that she wasn't going to get much sleep at this point, she went back to her phone and dialed up her good friend John, who she knew would be up at this hour. He was a vampire, after all. "Hello?" he said brightly, as though he was positively bursting with energy. He must have already eaten today. Not surprising, he was, after all, a blood clinic night security guard. It was the perk of the job. Make sure our shit doesn't get stolen, you get to have some of our back stock that's about to go bad. "John," she said tiredly. The events of the day had worn on her, and she knew she had no hope of matching his enthusiasm, however glad she was that he was there to answer the phone. "Lely," he said excitedly. "Up working on a case and need some company?" he offered, knowing that she was normally only up at this hour because of a difficult case, and usually bounced ideas off of him. "Something like that. It's a long story, but would you mind coming over? I could sure use a friend right now. I'll explain everything when you get here, I promise." "Sure thing, Lely," he said reassuringly. "I should be there in a few minutes." "I'll keep my window open," she said with a soft chuckle before hanging up the phone. With the phone once more secured on its receiver, she walked over to her wide front living room window and opened it, letting in the chilly night air. She was half tempted to put her coat back on, but knew that she would get no end of teasing from John about how she was always a detective even when she was at home. He loved to remind her that she needed to separate work and home life, and that she should leave her work at the door more often. Easy to say that, when it doesn't call you up every hour of the day. She instead sat back on her sofa, legs outstretched so that her feet were lightly touching her coffee table. Grabbing the blanket that was folded up on the side of the couch, she draped it over herself to keep warm as she waited. She needn't have bothered, evidently, as only a few moments later, not even long enough for her toes to thaw, she heard the familiar screech of a bat signifying its arrival. It fluttered into her home and vanished in a puff of smoke. In its place was her friend John. A tall, thin, pale man with bright green eyes, short brown hair, and a teasing smile already playing on his lips. "Cold?" he asked, already going to the window to shut it. She nodded and rose, wrapping the blanket around herself as she did so. "Here, I'll make us some coffee and you'll tell me all about your latest case. How's that sound?" She nodded tiredly, greatly looking forward to the caffeine intake that she hadn't had all day. She sat back down at his urging that she needed to relax, as he popped into the kitchen to make them coffee. And he literally popped in with a puff of smoke. He did so love to use his teleportation abilities rather than just walking. For a vampire, he was incredibly lazy. "You wouldn't believe the day that I've had, John," she said, as he flitted back into the living room, appearing on the couch next to her in another puff of smoke. She didn't even flinch. She was so accustomed to him doing that, and so kept going with her complaint. "The contract is good money, don't get me wrong, but still. It's she flailed her arms when the frustration and the feeling of being trapped got caught in her throat. "Complicated?" he offered when she struggled to find words. She nodded. "Tell me about it. Surely it's something that you, of all people, can figure a way out of." He smiled encouragingly. "Here, let me get some coffee for us and you can tell me all about it." He rose and grabbed 2 mugs from her cupboard, filling them with the dark liquid. Taking one of the mugs gratefully, she sipped at it before adding some sugar. Setting her mug down, she noted that he had taken his black, and shook her head, wondering how he could stand the bitterness of it that way. She took a deep breath, nodded and began. "One Mr. Cooper is looking for his missing daughter." She started with a sigh. "Serious case," John nodded. "But not your first disappearance case for sure." She shook her head. "No, far from it. Still, the thing that complicates things is that the excavators are definitely involved in the kidnapping." John's already pale face lost what little color it had. "The excavators," he repeated slowly, as if his mind couldn't fully wrap around the danger that she potentially now faced if she didn't play her cards right. She nodded. "Worse, I have it on fairly reliable authority that they're working either with or for the syndicate." "I'm sorry," John said with a wave of his hands in front of him. "But maybe I'm hopped up on too much caffeine." He blinked owlishly at her. "You're telling me that a girl got kidnapped, and not only are the excavators involved, but so are the syndicate? And you're not scared off yet?" he asked as he set his coffee down on her coffee table. "I'm only more intrigued and I want answers," she nodded. "And if things pan out tomorrow, I'll have a ticket to their next meeting." "How on earth did you manage that one?" John gasped. "I was contacted by a vampire that I ran into in the alley next to my office. Evidently, he wants to meet up and escort me to the meeting that I was hoping to infiltrate." "Sounds like a trap." "It probably is," she agreed with a nod. "But I still need answers, and a girl is missing. I need to know where she is, if she's safe, and whether or not I'll be able to get her home." They took their mugs into the kitchen to refill, their cups having been depleted of their liquid. "Well," John said as he sipped on his fresh coffee. He nodded to himself, like he had settled on something. "You're not going alone. I'm going to tail you to the meeting, and if things go south, I can at least get you out of there quickly." "You know I can." Her eyes widened. "John, I can't ask you to do that." "Then it's a good thing you don't have to," John winked. "Funny how things work out like that." Chapter 3. John had offered to stay the night and keep watch over the apartment while Leliana got some sleep. At first she protested, but when he brought up the point that vampires were involved and he would at least be able to get her out in a tight spot, she had no real counter-argument. So, he stayed in the living room and kitchen area, keeping an eye out for signs that they weren't alone in the area and that they were being watched. It was silly, but the extra protection of one of her dearest friends helped her exhausted mind get a good night's sleep. When she woke at dawn, she offered him her bed to rest in until they left, which he took gratefully. As she sipped her freshly brewed coffee, she contemplated the task at hand. She still had about 10 hours before she was to meet up with that vampire that she had a run-in with, and she still didn't know how to feel about it. On the one hand, she couldn't deny that the stranger had captivated her in some odd way. She knew that it had almost nothing to do with him using a charm on her, because she would have become helpless to his whims, which didn't happen. She supposed that was part of the reason she was intrigued by him. He could have easily charmed her into just obeying his every whim last night, but he didn't, and opted to simply talk his way out of the situation when he could. That alone put him in higher regard than most strangers that she met in dark alleyways. That wasn't to say that she necessarily trusted her newfound ally, just that she was intrigued by him and wanted to learn more. In this day and age, with the world at war and everyone out for themselves, it was hard for her to want to trust anyone outside of her closest friends, but here she was, putting her life in the hands of someone she literally met less than a full day ago. She opted to pass the time by looking over cases, drinking more coffee, and making sure that her .45 was cleaned, loaded with bullets with crosses engraved into them, and secured in her thigh holster where she could easily access it should things turn south quickly. "Morning," John yawned from the bedroom suddenly. She looked up from loading her gun in its holster and blinked at him, before stealing a glance at the clock. It was evidently already noon, which meant that she needed to start getting ready. "Afternoon," she greeted with a smile. I should shower and get ready. I'll be leaving here at about 3. He nodded sleepily, clearly not quite ready to face the day. There's still half a pot of coffee, but feel free to make more if you need it, she said as she stood up, stretching her arms above her head. When he nodded with a sleepy grunt of confirmation, she laughed softly and brushed past him as he shuffled off to the kitchen, no doubt to drink some coffee. It was still so bizarre that she was getting dolled up for what may very well be a death trap, she thought to herself as she walked into the bathroom. Still, she conceded as she started her shower and got ready. Best to make herself look presentable. Water poured from the faucet, and by the time that she shed her clothing and stepped in, steam had begun to rise from the tub and fill the room. Once she was inside and the water hit her bare flesh, she all but moaned.
Censored.
As the hot water began to work at her aching and tired muscles. For a while she simply stood there, letting the water race down her creamy ebony skin in rivulets, before finally forcing herself to lather her hair and body, scrubbing away the last month's worth of stress, knowing that she was going to have to be at her best in order to constantly remind herself that it was not, in fact, a date with anything but death if she wasn't careful. Finally, as she emerged from the shower and toweled off, she felt like she was filled with more energy than she had felt all week, and felt almost normal again for the first time in a long time. Pulling on her undergarments and brushing her hair out, she draped her towel around her and walked as fast as she could back in her bedroom to stave off the chill. Thankfully, John was still in the kitchen, occupied with consuming enough caffeine to wake up to bother noticing. She pulled her closet door open and began to scan the clothes hung there to try and find something suitable for this meeting. With a sigh, she settled on a long-sleeved, off-the-shoulder sheath dress made of soft ruby fabric that clung to her every curve and flared off at the hip and cut off at the knees, the perfect dress to keep her gun hidden with. She plucked it out of the closet and set to work dressing herself. Her makeup, an alluring smoky eyeshadow and accentuated with full garnet-stained lips, was put on with relative swiftness, if a bit fumblingly. It had been a while since she'd tarted herself up after all. Satisfied with how she looked so far, she let her steadily drying hair fluff out, pulling the thick tresses into a neat bun while she rummaged around for a hair clip. Pinning her hair to hold it in place, she found her old faux gold hair clip with costume gemstones that matched her dress in it, and pinned it to the side of her bun to accentuate the style. Pleased with how her hair and makeup turned out, she began to debate between her 3 pairs of shoes. Settling on a pair of black kitten heels, just short enough that she could still easily move but stylish enough to be worn at a formal meeting, she stepped into them, giving herself a once-over in the mirror. She hardly recognized herself for how different she looked, with a little bit of makeup and a dress, as opposed to her typical business attire and peacoat. All set then? John asked as she walked out of her bedroom. She nodded, and noted that he was noticeably more awake now that he had some sleep and some coffee in his system, which she was grateful for. That dress is really flattering on you. You look beautiful in it, even if I know you'd really rather be in your work clothes. They shared a laugh. Thank you, John, that means a lot. She sighed. We'd better head out and meet up with this guy. Who knows what would happen if we were late? John nodded, his smile fading. I'll stick to the rooftops and keep close to you. That way if anything happens, I can swoop in and grab ya, he said with a smirk. She nodded. Sounds like a plan, John. I'll head out and stick to the sidewalk so it's easier to spot me. With the plan in motion, Leliana left her building and made her way to Gia's. It was a nice shop, she had to admit, as she came here often for some coffee or hot chocolate if she had a day off where she could just sit and take in the atmosphere. Sadly, this wasn't one of those days. Shame she didn't have time yesterday, as this might very well be her own personal death march. No, she thought with a shake of her head. Thoughts like that weren't going to help her walk away alive, not if she went in expecting to die. A person like that might get reckless. As small as it was, she resolved to go to that coffee shop after all of this was over and order the biggest mug of tea that she could buy. It might seem insignificant, but she always liked to stick to the plans that she made, and she resolved to see this one through. Thankfully, the walk wasn't long, and it didn't take her that much time to get there. She stole a glance at one of the higher building rooftops, and saw a flicker of what she sincerely hoped was John, moving to a better vantage point. She only had a few blessed bullets after all. I can't say I'm surprised that you're early. She turned at the sound of the stranger's voice, and began to hope even harder that it was John that she saw on the roof. Or that you didn't come alone. You didn't tell me to, she reasoned, shifting her weight onto one foot to
censored
her hip. His bright blue eyes followed the motion appreciatively, and she couldn't help but feel at least a little pretty because of it. Call her an old-fashioned broad, but it was always nice when her hard work paid off, no matter what it related to. His chuckle rumbled in his
censored,
and she swore that she could feel it in hers as well. She shuddered at the sensation. That's fair enough, I suppose. I might have, if I knew that your friend was going to be another vampire, he said smoothly. I don't like competition. His eyes roved over her entire body, making her shudder again. She felt like his gaze was doing more than undressing her. It felt like he was staring into her very heart to learn all of her secrets, and she wasn't entirely sure whether or not she liked that feeling. You two should get along just fine then, she said, understanding the meaning behind his words. He was interested in her, and she couldn't deny that she held some interest of her own. Whether or not she would act on it would depend on what went down tonight, and if they both made it out of it alive. I grew up with him, so it isn't like that. We're practically siblings, and I'm sure his wife would shoot me on principle if I bothered with him. Ah, that's good, he purred, offering her his arm. Shall we head to the meeting then? I simply can't wait to show you off. You never introduced yourself, sir, she said, but looped her arm in the crook of his as they made their way to the nearest entrance to the metro, the only way to get to the underground. Ah, how incredibly rude of me, he said as they walked down the steps and into the darkness of the metro. It's Victor. Victor Marley, and I'm something of an independent party in all this as well. Chapter 4. So, you're not with the excavators or the syndicate? Leliana asked with a frown. And yet, you still got an invitation to this meeting between them? How? Just when she thought she had a grasp on the situation, there was always a curveball, she thought with no small amount of frustration. I'm just as I said, an individual party. I take care of some of the less than savory things that the syndicate doesn't want its hands dirtied with. I get paid and that's that. Are you involved with the kidnappings? She asked in a low voice with an arched brow. My, you certainly don't speak in riddles. I admire that, he said with a soft smile. But no, nothing like that. I'm mostly just a courier for them. But I learned of these kidnappings that the excavators are doing on behalf of the syndicate, and well, he grimaced. I want out of the game. They've gone too far with this. A man with principles, she said, as they ducked into one of the vault entrances to the underground. While it wasn't forbidden to go there, and the place was common knowledge, it was better that no one saw them specifically going down just yet. Something I can admire. You wouldn't happen to know where any of the kidnapped people went, do you? No, but I intend to find out at the meeting, he said with a shrug. I heard you talking to that Mr. Cooper, and knew that the both of us would have a greater chance of success than just myself going down there and demanding answers. I'm assuming you're armed? She nodded. Good, I like to see someone come prepared. And I can smell this John fellow not far behind us. Things will go much smoother with the three of us, I'm sure. I would rather nothing happen to either of you, she said honestly, as they began to work their way through the streets of the underground. As strange and otherworldly as it was, Leliana felt more at home with the feeling of cobblestone under her shoes and the smell of the underground lake than hearing the taxicabs rushing past her apartment back above ground. If we get out of this, I intend to show my gratitude, Victor. Is that so? He asked with a tilt of his head, as they stopped in front of the Red Baron Inn. Vampires, werewolves, and humans alike all shuffled past them with barely a glance in their direction. Some things simply bridge the species gap, Leliana noted with a sigh. And just what were you going to do to show me such gratitude? Invite you over to my place for coffee, she said with a wink. And see what happens after that. Maybe it was the fact that they all could very well die, or the fact that she had been utterly charmed by this vampire, but whatever the reason was, Leliana couldn't properly articulate just why she rocked forward on her toes and pressed her lips to his in that moment, beyond the fact that doing so just felt right. "Ah," she said with a flush when he didn't respond. "Perhaps I've been too forward." "Or not forward enough," he rumbled as he reached towards her, touching her chin with startlingly familiarity, as though he had always known her and was merely reaching out to her very soul. His hand didn't stop there, as he allowed his palm to go up the side of her face, gently stroking her cheek. She sighed, and
censored
the palm of his hand before pressing against it slightly. He carted his hand through her hair then, bringing her gently to his lips, pressing his against hers gently. His lips were soft and warm, and they moved skillfully over hers. She sighed blissfully against his talented mouth, hands coming up to grip the front of his coat. She felt him grip her shoulders just firmly enough to know that she was grounding him in that moment, and she was grateful for his reciprocation of her affection. "But let us save this for the victory party, yes?" he asked with a fanged grin. "We wouldn't want your friend to get too uncomfortable." She flushed even deeper and stepped away from Victor fully. She had completely forgotten that her best friend was waiting for them to go in, so that he could stay behind and wait for when he was needed as backup. "And besides," he said, crooking a finger under her chin and guiding her eyes back to his, "we have a day to save, yes? So let's save it." She nodded firmly, hooked her arm in his once again, and together they opened the door to the inn and stepped inside. Chapter 5. She had to admit, as awful of an organization as the syndicate were and for how dirty their money was, they spent it well in the Red Baron Inn as far as she was concerned. The place was decorated in rich reds and deep blacks, and the place felt like a proper Victorian inn, something that was rather hard to come by even in the underground. The carpet was plush under her shoes, and the walls were ornate without being tacky. As much as she hated the syndicate, she had to concede to the point that they had very good taste in interior decorating. "Ah, so good to see you again, Mr. Marley," said the bellman behind the counter with a smile that looked entirely too tight for her comfort. She subtly shifted closer to Victor, who wore a nearly predatory grin. "Evening, Greer," Victor said politely, placing a hand at the small of Leliana's back to reassure her. "I've come for the meeting. I even brought my +1 this time." "Oh, how marvelous," the man Greer said, his face stretching impossibly wider around his smile. Leliana's stomach churned at the sight, and already she was beginning to dread coming here. She hoped that John was going to stay out of sight, and not try anything rash too soon. "Right this way, they've been expecting you," he said, ushering them into a room marked ballroom beside the door. He held the door open for them and bowed grandly. "Please do go on in." He leered at them, his gaze lingering on Leliana for far longer than would be considered appropriate as they walked past and into the room. All the while, Victor didn't remove his hand from the small of her back and continued to guide her as they walked. The room that they entered was far less of a ballroom and much more of a business suite, but she was hardly in a position to split hairs about it, she thought, as they came to a stop just inside the room. The door clicked shut softly behind them, leaving them in the dim lighting of the space. In the center of the room was a plush armchair that seated the woman that Leliana knew as Veronique Lawson, the head of the syndicate. The private eye's jaw tightened, and she mentally ticked the seconds it would take her to draw her pistol and end things. Then she scanned the room and found that it wasn't just the three of them in the room. The more she looked around, the more goons she saw surrounding the three of them in the dim lighting of the space. If Miss Lawson was looking to intimidate her, she couldn't deny that she was effective at the job. "Ah, Mr. Marley, Miss Tornbow, how lovely to have you as our guests," Veronique practically purred as she crossed her legs sensually in her seat. "And so surprising that you finally took us up on the offer to bring in someone with you, Victor." She smiled like a snake about to devour a mouse. It was hard for Leliana not to squirm with discomfort. "You picked a pretty one." "My compliments on your," she licked her lips, her
censored
playing over her elongated fangs slowly to accentuate them. "Taste." Leliana suppressed a flinch and stepped forward. "I think we both know why I agreed to come," she said in a clear voice. My dear, I'm sure I don't. Don't pretend, Veronique, she ground out, her patience at an end. I know that the syndicate isn't so sloppy as to leave so much evidence behind. Not even the excavators are that careless. She knew she was baiting them, and it was clearly working. Those in the room that were excavators growled at her, baring their fangs at her. And you knew that someone would come snooping. You knew that it would never be the cops, so you had every local private eye on watch to see which family broke and asked for help first. Perceptive, Veronique said, clearly surprised but somehow not even fazed. You're better than the other investigators I've had to deal with. She leaned further into her seat toward them. I like you. Prove it, and let all the people you've kidnapped go. She challenged. Veronique let out a surprised cackle, accompanied by the chuckles of the other men and women surrounding them. Oh, you're bold, aren't you? Veronique sneered. Tell you what, I'm feeling generous. I'll let them go and return them to their homes tonight on one condition. Leliana didn't like the way that she was eyeing her, or the way that some of the goons around them were beginning to shift. None of it spelled good things for them, she thought, as she recalculated whether or not she would have enough time to draw her pistol. She knew that if even one of the vampires in the room was armed, that she didn't stand a chance of even getting her gun out of its holster. She cursed internally. Name it, and I'll consider, Leliana said, hoping that it would at least buy her some time to think of a way to get out of this. Damn it, where had John gone? She hoped that nothing had happened to him. Veronique let out a low laugh as she leaned back in her armchair. You'll owe me a favor, one that I'll be able to collect wherever and whenever I want. One that isn't negotiable, and that you have to complete as I say, or I take your life. She smiled low and cat-like, and Leliana's skin crawled. She didn't like this idea one bit. She knew that if she took it, she would most likely have to do something unspeakable in exchange. She may not have gotten to know Veronique for very long, but she didn't need to know that this was how she operated. Don't take that deal, Victor said low in her ear, his breath caressing her face. She's a viper, and one favor could ruin you. Oh, don't listen to him, darling, Veronique said in mock hurt. It's just one itty-bitty little favor after all. Leliana knew better, but feared what would happen when she gave her answer. She could certainly guess, and just hoped that these goons were all terrible shots. No deal, she said in a clear voice. I know better than to trust you. Though she put on a brave front, she clenched her hands to hide the fact that they were shaking. Ah, the syndicate leader said with a pout. How disappointing. And here I thought things were going so well between us. She shrugged and waved a hand. Oh well. It was nice knowing you. Leliana saw some of the goons reaching for their guns, and knew already that unless something happened to disarm them, she was done for. Even with Victor, he was only one vampire. Surely he wouldn't be able to help her, let alone assuming that he would even want to. Everything that happened after that seemed to occur in slow motion. She pulled out her gun just as one of the goons took a shot, squeezing the trigger on her life, she was sure. Then the next thing she knew, the gun misfired, and she felt the bullet whiz past her, grazing her cheek, but not fatally injuring her. When the shock wore off, she saw John and Victor whirring past her, claws bared, teeth gnashed, and taking out guards two at a time. They must not have been expecting it, or maybe not all of the guards were vampires like she originally thought, but she took a few shots at some of them. The ones that were vampires began to scream and writhe because of the blessing bestowed upon her bullets, but the others merely flinched and dropped their weapons. Veronique was shouting something at the few of her men that were still standing, but Leliana had no real chance to see it, as Victor scooped her up like a groom would his bride and dashed off out of the building, through the underground and into the night. Chapter 6. Though she knew that they weren't, it felt as though Leliana was flying from how fast that Victor was sprinting over the rooftops. She appreciated that he didn't try anything theatrical, and opted to just get them as far away as possible. She worried for John. She managed to see him running behind them, but she hasn't seen him since they left the Red Baron Inn, and she feared the worst. John is going to be all right, Victor said as though he sensed her thoughts. He's heading to his house to check on his wife. He said he would come to your house later tonight to check on you. I'm relieved he made it out too, she sighed, looking up at him. So where are we headed? My place. Victor nodded. The syndicate won't dare give chase tonight. We took out a large number of them, and Veronique isn't one for doing things herself. We've got time to regroup and get a plan together. We still don't know where the kidnapped people are, Leliana said glumly. We'll find them, he promised as they neared her apartment window. Don't you worry about that. Right now we just need to lay low for a little while. He smirked down at her as he stopped outside her apartment. Besides, I've been looking forward to that gratitude that you were going to show me. She smirked flirtatiously at him as he opened her window and slipped them both inside. She turned to say something to him, but was cut off when his mouth came down upon her neck, ravishing her with
censored
and teasing the flesh with his
censored.
As she turned and shut the window and locked it, Leliana's hand automatically fumbled for the light switch. Evidently they didn't need it, or at least that must have been Victor's conclusion for how firmly he pressed her against the wall beside the window. Even as he crashed his mouth into hers, the vampire's elongated fangs teasing her lower lip, she found that she wanted more of him. They let their mouths dance out an intricate battle for dominance in the muted moonlight that bled in through the window beside them, until the need for air inarguably outweighed their need for release.
This scene has been censored to provide a safe and enjoyable reading experience for everyone.
We should probably clean up. She laughed and nodded, going into the bathroom to take care of that. With the task completed, she walked back out to where Victor was sitting on her bed, still
censored.
A thought occurred to her, and she smiled down at him. Hey, we made it out of there all right, yeah? She asked. He breathed a laugh. You could say that, yes. Well, I made a promise to myself for if I made it out of there, she grinned. Want to go and get some coffee? I'd like to get to know the man that saved my life a little better. He grinned as they began to dress. I could think of worse things to do, he said as he clasped his hand in hers. Lead the way. Thank you for reading my book. If you like this story, I think you'll enjoy my book. Get a copy of Cain now, free. A big favor to ask. I would really love it if you could take a few seconds to leave me a review. Thank you so much in advance. A big favor to ask. I would really love it if you could take a few seconds to leave me a review. Thank you so much in advance. About the author. Selina Coffey is a romance writer who lives happily in London with her husband and son. She is a hopeless romantic who grew up always believing in love, and she is not ashamed to admit this. It is this belief that makes her so passionate about writing crazy love stories. A stereotypical girly girl, she loves shopping. So whenever she gets a chance and the spare cash, you will probably find her browsing online for the next pair of shoes to add to her collection. You can find her online at www.selinacoffee.com. Contact her at hello@selinacoffee.com. Closing credits. This has been Going Underground. Written by Selina Coffey. Auto-narrated using Google technology. Copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited. Production copyright 2024 by Lovie Books Limited.